The Necropolis is the first area of Little Nightmares 3, and thanks to the game's marketing, is also the one we know by far the most information about. Over the past year, Bandai has released an announcement trailer, a lengthy gameplay walkthrough, 2 producer interviews, a friendship trailer, and most recently, a gameplay commentary trailer, all revealing different parts of this strange location and the unsettling creatures who live there. I suspect the reason they're showing us so much of this one area is so they can keep the rest a secret, but regardless, with such a wealth of information to pull from now, I figured it was about time to take a deep dive into this mysterious city to try piecing together a rough timeline and figure out what might have happened to bring about its destruction. Before getting into that though, I want to briefly acknowledge that all the footage of this area we've seen is unfinished and subject to change in the full release of the game. In fact, we've already seen significant changes to some elements over the marketing cycle, like the physical appearance of the dwellers, so anything I use as evidence in this video could be cut and no longer be relevant. As such, my intent is simply to show and explain everything we know so far, not to provide any definitive answers. On a related note, while this video is focused primarily on Little Nightmares 3, there will be some general spoilers for both the first and second games, so make sure you're caught up before watching. The Necropolis is a pretty unique location in several ways. It's the first desert environment to appear in the franchise, it's the first area that we've seen both during the day and at night, and most interestingly, the city appears to be from a completely different time period relative to the other places we've seen in Nowhere, with primitive technology and a distinct visual style. A useful overview of the Necropolis was provided by the game's producer Coralie Faniello, who explained that it is a peculiar place that has been raised from the desert sand and is powered by gusting winds. It has been described as a city of eternal energy and certain death. It used to be inhabited by the dwellers, but now the ancient metropolis is more of a ghost town. All that is left is sand, ruins, some disturbing statues, and forever turning windmills. That line about it once being inhabited is of particular interest to me, as it implies that the city wasn't always a place of death and at one point was actually alive and functional. So what might it have looked like back then? To answer this, let's try going back to the very beginning. At some point in the long and esoteric history of Nowhere, a great city was raised from these fiery desert sands. Whether that means it was dreamt into existence by the collective trauma of countless children in the waking world or simply built by the residents themselves is unknown, but I'll come back to that later. While the environment here was quite hostile, it was nonetheless an excellent place for a city due to the powerful winds that blew through it, which could be harnessed as a source of eternal energy. Giant windmills were constructed to do exactly that, towering high above much of the city, and with their energy the dwellers milled great quantities of grain, crushing it finely to be stored in large barrels until it could be sold or baked into bread. They also produced fine spools of thread on spinning wheels to be used in colorful fabrics, wove large baskets, and shaped intricate works of pottery, all to be sold in the street market. Most notably, they made an industry out of the giant flocks of birds native to the region, catching them in special nets to be strung up or held in metal cages. It's hard to say for sure whether these are crows or ravens, as both birds are quite similar in appearance and behavior, but based on the sounds of their calls, I think they're probably ravens. Also, for what it's worth, Lo's mask is described as a raven mask on the official website, so there is a precedent for these birds being chosen over crows. Regardless, both types of birds are well known for their glossy black feathers, and these are what the dwellers wanted. A great deal of bags can be seen stuffed with the feathers as if they were to be exported out to other regions, and one even has what appears to be an insignia on it, perhaps the official symbol of the city. A portion of these bags were obtained by local craftsmen who fashioned tools like umbrellas to shield them from the hot sun, and the many bird skulls left behind from the feather harvesting process were collected and used for some purpose as well. Overall, the dwellers seem to have been fairly normal by Nowhere standards, and it looks like this city might have been a decent place to live. Or at least it would have been, except all of these things were done under the gaze of the ever-watchful eyes. Found over doorways, on the sides of buildings, and engraved on stone floors, these eyes serve as a constant reminder that in the world of Nowhere, you are never truly alone. And then, of course, Monster Baby happened, smashing up the city and petrifying its inhabitants with rays of blinding light. Curiously, this power only affected the humans of the city and not any of the animals. Not a single petrified bird or insect can be seen, and in the gameplay commentary trailer, a bird flies directly through the light without any issue. Eventually, the city's entire population was reduced to dust, their absence providing the perfect opportunity for giant desert beetles to move in and carve deep spiral burrows into the abandoned dwellings. So that brings us to the current state of the Necropolis as experienced by Low and Alone, but its history is a little more complicated than this brief summary makes it out to be. For example, the city's downfall doesn't appear to have happened all at once, but was instead a gradual process, with conditions progressively worsening until the end. Throughout the city, dwellers can be found petrified in many places and positions, moments of life frozen in time according to official description, showing where they were and what they were doing when they were cornered, like walking down the street or sitting in a workshop. In addition to these crumbling statues, there are also a great many dwellers tied up in body bags, most of which are strung up on ropes crisscrossing the city, bringing a new layer of meaning to the name City of the Dead. It's unclear exactly how long these bodies have been here or for what purpose they were hung up, but I can think of several possibilities. First, when monster babies started ravaging the city, perhaps the dwellers found they could distract it with these hanging bodies, much as real babies are kept occupied by their suspended mobiles. They may have turned on each other for survival, killing their neighbors to string up in a futile attempt to appease this new tantrum-prone god. Alternatively, it's possible that some kind of plague struck the city before or during Monster Baby's attack, and as the bodies piled up, the survivors began hoisting them up on ropes to keep them farther away and prevent the disease from spreading. Whatever the case may be, none of the dwellers' efforts proved to be effective in the long term, and sooner or later all fell victim either to Monster Baby or to each other. I'll talk about the baby in just a minute, but first, there's another important piece of the story to consider, one that may provide exactly the context we need to understand it. Just outside the walls of the city, many suitcases can be seen strewn about, their contents scattered by the relentless wind. It was previously uncertain where these might have come from, but the new gameplay commentary trailer reveals their source, a massive ship lodged in the deep sand. We even get a good look at the interior of this stranded vessel, a storage area with suitcases stacked high and a mirror curiously propped up in the center. And as Low and Alone make their way out of the ship, a number of familiar details can be seen in and around it. Discarded shoes and socks, a dead rat, a small toy block, and a large bulbous resident lying in the sand. These all feel very carefully placed to remind us of the Maw, and they absolutely are, for a picture of the Maw clearly visible in the storage area all but proves that this was a ship transporting guests to the Great Watery Giant, much like the one seen offloading its passengers in the first game. The big question is, of course, why didn't the ship make it? Did something happen to the Maw? While we don't know what Six did after usurping the lady and climbing to the top of the vessel at the end of the game, it's possible that she boarded the next ship and escaped, leaving the Maw bereft of a keeper and all future ships bereft of a destination. Maybe this just so happens to be the ship we heard after the credits, carrying Six away to a new place, and Low and Alone are now unknowingly following in her footsteps. That is some pretty shaky speculation though, and I do have some other possible explanations as to how this ship got here, but those will have to wait for a future video. For now, we're talking about the Necropolis, and so I want to focus on the ramifications of the ship being here for this city specifically. First and foremost, its presence strongly implies that the Necropolis is adjacent to the same ocean traversed by the Maw, or at least a body of water connected to it, and though no water is shown in the trailer and there are no direct indications that this is or was a port city, a few small details may hint at this. By the ship's prow, we can see large boulders in the sand, a common sight on ocean shorelines, and some large objects in the distance could be the wreckage of other ships. What's more, all of the Necropolis infrastructure appears to be made out of adobe, or molded clay bricks, which would require a large and reliable source of water to be feasible for construction on this scale. Finally, large nets can be seen hung outside the wall, and while they could just be used for catching birds like I suggested earlier, they could just as well be fishing nets hung out to dry. Another more important consequence of the ship's presence here is the introduction of an apparent chronological discrepancy. It's pretty obvious that the Maw and the boats docking to it, not to mention everywhere else in Nowhere that we've seen, are set in a quasi-mid-20th century based on the televisions, fashion, and general architecture of ships and buildings. In stark contrast, the Necropolis appears thousands of years older, evoking ancient Egypt or Persia with its own distinct technology, fashion, and architecture. It's even officially referred to as the Ancient Metropolis. There's something quite jarring about seeing these two worlds collide, and it begs the question, how could they both exist at the same time? The easy answer to this is simply that they don't. The Necropolis must have been destroyed thousands of years ago, and these are just old ruins that the ship's passengers stumbled upon, right? Well, even acknowledging the inconsistency and relativity of time in Nowhere, there's one really big problem with that assumption, a problem with giant toddling legs and an insatiable desire to play. Monster Baby is officially described as one of the new residents of Little Nightmares 3. Her size, clumsiness, and curiosity will be a great danger for players, and you will have to escape from her grasp and her gaze. She might also have something to do with what happened to the Necropolis and to the inhabitants. They aren't being very subtle here. Monster Baby is clearly implicated in the city's destruction, but if that really is the case, then why does it look like a mid-20th century doll? This dress with the buttons and fringe around the collar doesn't match the aesthetic of the Necropolis at all, and is in fact quite similar to dolls observed aboard the Maw, some of which have a similar fringe. Based on this pretty significant detail, I strongly believe that, somehow, Monster Baby's origin is this ship. The Necropolis was until recently a functioning city, its inhabitants living out their routine lives, but everything changed one day when this ship arrived unexpectedly on their shores. Those on board ventured out, both the would-be guests who were supposed to be feasting and the little gray gnomes who were supposed to be running the ship's furnace. They brought with them objects, technologies, and perhaps even diseases that the dwellers were not prepared for, and through some sequence of events that remains shrouded in mystery, Monster Baby was born and ensured the certain death of every living soul within the city walls. I came up with a lot of truly wild theories to explain this big gap in the story, but ultimately none of them felt solid enough to propose in this video. There's still just so much we don't know, critical context still missing, and we'll probably just need to wait for the full release to get any satisfying answers. However, there is one small theory worth mentioning, which is that Monster Baby might be an entity like the Signal Tower. This isn't a new theory, of course. Back when the creature was first revealed, people were quick to point out the similarities between it and Little Nightmares 2 concept art showing the flesh of the Signal Tower taking the shape of a large baby, and it certainly appears as though Supermassive could be finally implementing this idea that ended up on the cutting room floor. But there's also some evidence for this in the game itself. In one shot of the gameplay walkthrough, Monster Baby peers into a room in which Lo and Alone are hiding, and for a brief moment we get a good look at its working eye before it blinks. It appears wet and organic, not dry and glassy like you might expect from a porcelain doll, and bears a really suspicious resemblance to the many eyes of the Signal Tower. I think it's definitely possible that we're seeing another living structure here, albeit in a different form, a huge mass of flesh and eyes tightly packed into a giant walking shell. And somehow, Lo and Alone will need to find a way past it. We don't know for sure why the children came to the Necropolis, or even whether or not it was intentional, but I think the plan now that they're here is to find another mirror that will let them leave. Quite possibly the one shown at the beginning of the Friendship trailer, since they reach it during the night. I think this is far from the only mirror we'll see in this area, though. In the gameplay commentary trailer, Lo and Alone pass through a room filled with numerous chalk drawings, some of which are visible while others are obscured by shadow. It's pretty hard to make out exactly what we're looking at here, but one of the elements is clearly a set of oval mirrors, with arrows showing how they can be adjusted to shine light in different directions using a system of gears. We also see what might be an eye set upon a tower, and once the light has been reflected directly into that eye, it is blinded, being scribbled out in the next panel. My guess is that these drawings were made by other children who passed through the Necropolis, leaving them behind as instructions for future travelers. Perhaps Lo and Alone will need to use these mirrors to evade Monster Baby, reflecting its petrifying gaze either back into itself or onto something in the environment, giving them just enough time to slip through its clutches. So that about wraps up my literal interpretation of the Necropolis, but there's another very important side to this discussion that I wanted to briefly touch on: the nature of Nowhere itself. Thanks to a variety of sources, most notably the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, we know that this world doesn't operate like our own. Here, places and creatures exist for specific reasons, and I believe those reasons are tied to the trauma and fears of children in the waking world. Nowhere is a place where their nightmares literally become a reality, so an important question we must ask of the Necropolis is, why does this location need to exist in the first place? Or in other words, what is the core theme? All of the other major locations we've seen in Nowhere have a clear answer. The Maw is hunger, the Signal Tower is escapism, and the Nest is connection. But what does the Necropolis offer? In my analysis of Nowhere video, I theorized it was either warmth or sleep. The desert city is known as a place of eternal energy, after all, and its former inhabitants are all in a state of permanent rest. But I don't find these explanations particularly satisfying and think there is something deeper going on here, perhaps some secret about Monster Baby that will recontextualize everything we thought we knew. Furthermore, I suspect that the Necropolis has some connection to the North Wind based on the prominent element of wind, the orange color palette, and the large number of birds in the city, all of which evoke the first issue of the print comics in a substantial way. Anyways, that's all for this video, and I sincerely hope you found it both entertaining and useful for understanding the Necropolis on a deeper level, even if some of it may turn out not to be true. There are so many interesting directions Supermassive could go with this area, and whatever direction that may be, I'm very excited to see it when Little Nightmares 3 releases next year. In the meantime, I would encourage you to check out my other theories on the channel if you haven't done so already, and be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell if you'd like to know as soon as new videos are posted. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.